Hello, and welcome to another episode of Bookish, a casual book club. I'm Sylvia Lee, once again, joined by my reading fellows in crime. Kofi Adiza and Laura Yu.
Hello.
Hello.
It's been a hot minute. We've been traveling and doing things, and we thought we would come back and have an episode about something that takes us back in the past a little bit. And it kind of came from a conversation that Laura and I had, but I think all three of us have had this at some point, about the books that really made us what we are today. People who, one, studied English, and two, who take great enjoyment in reading. And so I think one of the conversation threads that we had, or we have had over the past few years, has been those books that make us think like, how are they doing that? Or I didn't know books could do that, or that writing could do that. And so we thought, wouldn't this be a good episode to discuss the books that made us first think like that? So I'm really excited because these are some of my favorite conversations. So I guess we'll start with Laura, because she came with a stack of books, some with their original Post-it notes.
And from like 1994.
Yeah, these are vintage editions.
Yes.
So why don't we start with you, Laura?
Okay. So my coveted copy of Macbeth is where it all started. I went to Lake High School here in Columbia, and I had a Mr. Berkowitz in 10th grade, I think, 10th grade English, or was it 11th grade English? But we read Macbeth in that class, and we had to do this horrible thing, which was to keep an imagery journal and basically write down like every instance of various categories of imagery. So if it was like food imagery, like we had to make a list, and blood imagery or whatever. But it was such tedious work, right? That everybody hated it, but it made you read so carefully. So it was actually Macbeth and that class and Mr. Berkowitz when I decided I wanted to be an English major. Like until then, I really didn't. Like I liked reading. I always enjoyed reading and books. But yeah, it was Macbeth that did it for me. And then I went to college, and I don't think I took Shakespeare ever again.
You're like, that's enough.
I've heard all that I need to from William.
But it was in grad school, actually, when I had to revisit Shakespeare, and I ended up writing a paper about Macbeth. It was so interesting to sort of go back to Macbeth, from when I read it as a 16-year-old versus, in my early 20s in grad school. So very different experience. And then a second book I think was really, like, I didn't know books could do that kind of moment, was in college when I took an 18th century British literature class. And that is what I ended up studying in college and grad school. And Professor Bob Chipka, he was my favorite, but he was also that professor who was like really strict and really mean. And like by halfway through the semester, like the class had dwindled down to like half the size that it started with. And he took it as kind of a point of pride, But we read this book called Tristram Shandy. And it was one of those books that, especially being 18th century novel, it was so postmodern. It's by Lawrence Stern, and he starts out a story like it's going to be a memoir, like an autobiography, but the narrator makes these digressions, and he's playing with narrative structure. He's playing with the book as a thing. So he creates these pages where there's like a blank page. You'll turn the page and there's nothing there. And it's like supposed to be a place for you to like think about something that had just happened. Or he'll include these weird drawings or use asterisks or different symbols to indicate something. He'll break the fourth wall and like talk to the reader directly. And ultimately, he like never gets to the point that he was trying to make. So the very first opening scene of the book is he's talking about the moment of his conception of his parents having sex, and how he blames his mother because in that moment, she, for some reason, asks his father, "Did you remember to wind the clock?" And he's like, what kind of woman asks that in the middle of, and he blames that as the moment when he became who he is. Like it affected how, like his body, his humor, who he has become. So it's very like experimental. So especially for being, from that time, it was very forward, right? Experimental, doing something different and interesting. And it was definitely one of those, I didn't know books could do that kind of a moment, and got me hooked. And then even now, like I really, really am curious about when I open a book that are not just plot driven, but like it's doing something. The author is playing with something or experimenting with something or doing something that I haven't seen yet in a book. So that's always like really exciting to me. And I think that's what keeps me buying books and, or read books that I haven't read before, I've seen before. So I realized that I really am interested in the craft of the writing, but not because I'm a writer. I feel like that's something writers often read about and talk about, the craft, but I myself am not a writer, but I'm really interested in the craft of writing that you can then witness as a reader. So you are both writers. And so I'm curious to hear what you see in the books that you love about the craft of writing that gets you hooked.
It's not a real good segue to me.
Thanks for nothing, Laura.
Yeah.
So what got you hooked?
I think there has just been various situations through my journey. It's interesting you started with high school, and I hadn't even considered the stuff that I was reading in high school because I went to such a different kind of high school because Duke Ellington is not like your regular public school. And so the program I was part of is literary media arts. So that's where you get your journalism, radio production, and television production, and photography. And so the types of things we were reading were almost always kind of like journalistic. There were certain creative aspects to it, but for whatever reason, my creativity was frowned upon. Maybe because I gave way to the licentiousness and the lasciviousness in my writing at such a young age. And that was definitely frowned upon among the more puritanical teachings that I had, teachers that I had. So I think it wasn't until like by the time of my senior year that me and a couple of buddies, we did this documentary in DC that looked at young African-American males and how the city responded to us, especially in predominantly white spaces. And my buddy, Hayden, he had to read the opening to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. I mean, Hayden's a good reader, but there's such a cadence to Ralph Ellison's work that I hadn't really thought about before because I hadn't really read it. And then when I saw there was like 500 something odd pages, I was like, damn, you got a lot to say. But there's a certain type of rhythm. And I kind of felt like Ralph Ellison was kind of like William Shakespeare. That's like that high art. And as someone who was reading it, I kind of felt like that was something beyond me in a way. But it wasn't until I was in undergrad and I took the short story class at University of Maryland. That was my first stint at college. And then I left and then I went to University District of Columbia. But I was going to be a business major. And I remember the semester, it was 1990. I had Principles of Accounting 1, and I had a short story class, and I had some other classes. But it was in Principles of Accounting 1, when I had the book, the ledger, and all that stuff that I realized, I think I'm going to be an English major. Because I don't want to do all of this. This seems so tedious. And
I did not know this story.
I know. I'm like learning this for the first time.
It keeps it fresh. It keeps our relationship fresh. And so when I decided that there was this guy who was the professor, and he would read parts of things to us, and we all had to read like 3 different stories by Flannery O'Connor. And the one that really got me was A Good Man is Hard to Find. Yeah. That was such a great story. And I think everything, the sun, something, it's a long title.
Everything that rises must converge or something.
Must converge. Yes. I found her writing kind of lyrical, but also just really delicious to consume.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was also when we read The Short Happy Life of Francis McComber. I think we also read The Faithful by James Allen McPherson. And that short story class got me very much interested in not only reading short stories, but writing short stories.
Right.
And I think it was also the reading I was doing outside the academy. So once I was away from Maryland, basically we broke up. It was a mutual breakup, and that was in 91. I was working at the Library of Congress, and I would just do a lot of reading. And the one person whose books I read almost religiously was Ernest Gaines's books. And his seminal work, I guess people might say, his most important work was the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. I didn't read that book until I went to graduate school. The first book I read from him was A Gathering of Old Men. And I just thought that was I still think it's a perfect book. And that's when I thought, like, man, you can make short stories that can be a kind of novel that tells a whodunit of all things. And I just found his writing, I still find his writing just masterful. And it would be the two Southern writers that got me into it. But when I was at UDC, I took an English novel class by Dr. Bott. And I read Henry Fielding's Tom Jones. And I thought, oh man, if this is what the 18th century is about, I'm in. And so, I was kind of heading in that vein too. The Earl of Rochester was definitely my jam because he was heavy into the scatological and the sensual. And I kind of liked that. I was digging it. But as I said in an earlier interview with this young lady from University of Utah, 18th century didn't fit in my mouth, so to speak. The language wasn't the language that I could speak well. It wasn't the same rhythm, and it wasn't the rhythm of the community. And I found that that's what Southern writers do best. And so I kind of turned in graduate school and nah, I'm not going to do 18th century anymore.
I see.
But I had spent maybe 4 semesters doing 18th century. Even though this is cool, it's not my jam as much as I think it is. So that's a large nutshell, but that's sort of my origin story. And now your turn, Sylvia.
Yes, but before I get to my list, I'm curious because I think you said there are some books that made you want to become an English major or read more. And then there's some books that made you want to write.
Yeah.
And so now I'm curious, what are the books that made you want to write? Unless there's overlap, but which ones?
I would say definitely The Faithful by James Allen McPherson. In fact, I try to rewrite that story.
Really?
Yeah, because the story's about changing times, and you have this barber who is seeing people with afros, and he's also a religious person, and he's trying to get people to understand that you got to be groomed a certain kind of way. He's kind of an old school kind of guy. And then there's this church that has magical thumpings going on. And so he feels like he's in competition with this younger generation. And so this guy comes in who normally would come in and he wanted his fro stylized, and the guy doesn't do it the right way. And so the thing about being faithful to that story is trying to be faithful to traditions that have gone by the wayside. And so I try to rewrite that story and try to make it more about a woman. I remember the content. I made it a woman, and instead of afros, it was jury curls. So just try to keep it all cultural. The story didn't go well, but that's what got me going. And by the time I met Edward P. Jones, he's another writer whose work I try to mimic and learn certain things from. Most of the writers, I would say, that make me want to write fit within a kind of genre or category. Most of them are Southern. And I think there's something about Southern writers, regardless of their racial backgrounds. There's a certain potency and a certain rhythm in their work that I try to infuse in my own.
Yeah. Like you, I was only thinking about college, lists of college books, but then I think what Laura had mentioned before about high school, I thought, well, yeah, because for me, that impulse, right, that thought of like, wow, books can do that did start in high school. I just think I wasn't, I'd always been indoctrinated by my Asian parents that, what are you going to do with an English degree? There's no money in that. You need to become a lawyer at least, or something. And so I kind of put that on the shelf and I just thought, oh, I'm just going to enjoy reading. I do remember we had Shakespeare heavy curriculum as well in the beginning, and I actually really enjoyed his sonnets. I remember the first time I read the famous Hamlet soliloquy, I was like blown away. Like, how does this come out of somebody's like brain, like their imagination? I thought it was so interesting how these words that I use every day could be put together in this fashion and in this combination to create this, and like evoke this kind of emotional response. And that was the first time I remember thinking like there's some kind of power in that. And I didn't quite know what it was yet. But then I remember we were at my close friend who I'm still friends with to this day. Like we met when we were in preschool and we're still friends, but we were in the same English class and we got assigned to do a literary project on, of all books, The Catcher in the Rye. And I was like, ugh, like I hated The Catcher in the Rye. I was like, what an annoying, pretentious, like not pretentious. Yeah. What an annoying kind of like self-involved brat, like get over yourself. You think you have a heart, oh, boo me, I'm having an existential crisis because I'm coming of age. I was like, do you know what life is like for other people? Anyway, so I was like really annoyed and bitter that we had to do that. But we were sitting, I remember very distinctly, and Jocelyn, if you're listening to this, I don't know if you remember this either, but we were sitting in my dining room of my house and we were like, what are we going to do this project on? We just had no ideas. And then suddenly it just like came to us. I think Jocelyn was the first one actually to be like, what if we looked at the things that are like known but unknown to people? And like what we were actually talking about was a level of self-awareness that each character has about, that people have about themselves. And so we're like, what does Holden Caulfield know or not know, but other people know about him, and that's kind of what makes adolescence so cringy, like other people are there witnessing your most embarrassing, cringe-worthy moments. And you may think you're the coolest person ever. I'm so disillusioned. I'm so cool for this, but like other people are like, he's so insecure, And so what we decided to do is I had a stack of like teen magazines. And what we did was we scoured through them and we cut out like different images and words that would describe how each character, what they knew about the other characters that were unknown to that particular character. And so we created this 3D pyramid with each character on it, and the sides, like so Holden had his own side, and you would pull the side down and it would show everything that was hidden to him that he didn't know. The other character. And so for each character, it was like a 3D thing. Each character had their own thing. Anyways, this thing was so janky, right? Like, and it like looked like a little pyramid disco ball, right? Like it was so janky. And I was like, I don't know if this is going to be like whatever. So, and we had to present it. And she loved it so much.
The teacher?
Yeah, that she hung it like a disco ball in the middle of her classroom. And she hung it there for years.
Oh, wow.
And that was our sophomore year. Our senior year, it was still hanging there, like falling apart. She had like retaped it up together. And I was like, but that was the first time I really had fun with literary analysis, and I thought that, oh, okay, that was kind of fun.
Yeah.
And by the time I got into college, I thought I would be pre-law.
I did not know this.
Yeah.
I'm learning all kinds of things about my friends today.
Yeah. And so like I learned that, a lot of English majors actually go into law, but the track that I had to take was like a lot of rec comp, which is why I started learning about that too. And that was interesting. But I had to take as one of my electives a Caribbean literature class. And really it was post-colonial literature. I had read Jane Eyre in high school and as well. And I love that speech that Jane gives, to Mr. Rochester, like, I'm, also a gentleman, all this stuff. The feminist speech, right? And then I read Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys, which is a direct response to Jane Eyre. And for those of you who've read that book or are familiar with Bronte's novel, Jane is going to marry Mr. Rochester. They're all set. It's like the Cinderella kind of story. And then she finds out that he has a wife who has gone insane and is shut up into the attic of their house and sets the whole house on fire. And like, it's kind of a crazy thing if you think about it, but you don't really hear a lot from her. And so Jean Rhys, the author Jean Rhys, gave her a voice, right, in the form of Antoinette Causeway. And so Wide Sargasso Sea, reading that, our professor, the role of a good teacher, had us read Jane Eyre again. and then had us read Wide Sargasso Sea as like a conversation piece. And reading those two things, it was so like eye-opening. I think what you said is so true. Like these words never really fit in my mouth very well, right? But like to hear the response to it revealed a desire I didn't know that I'd had to hear like more, you know. And then the next class, I don't know if it was not the same professor, but it was another conversation between Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Ashebi's Things Fall Apart. And to me, that was so moving to hear the response and the humanity being provided, saying that this is just as valid as this sort of colonial view and gaze on things. And it really opened my eyes to the gaze that I had been operating under and that I didn't realize, like always felt a little lacking to me, right? So those were the two experiences where I was like, oh, all of literature is a conversation, you know, and that kind of extended to my appreciation for the craft and how different these books were, like you said, Laura, like crafted in the art of writing. And so those books really kind of got me thinking, like, when I open a book, like, what is this going to say? And what other conversation is it going to like bring up in me from the other things I've read? And that's the part I really like the most about it. And then just like you, Kofi, at the same time, there were other books, pieces that were like stirring in me like this desire to create as well, right? And for me, it came in the form of like poetry. Like in college, it wasn't really there in my freshman and sophomore years. In fact, I hated poetry like a lot of people. And then I decided on a whim to apply for this like poetry seminar that you had to get accepted to get into these workshops. So I was like, I'll just try, you know, and then I got accepted into these workshops. And there is where I really was open to what poetry can do in a very distilled form. And I think it takes me back, now that I think about it, to that soliloquy, that Hamlet soliloquy, right? The sonnets of Shakespeare's was, you know, I think to me the most powerful over everything, right? So, you know, the idea of like, what can you do in like a distilled form, right? Where each line carries a lot of weight and matters. And so when I started reading poems, it was the poems that had a very strong image at the center of it that really kind of made me want to create, like, write out my own images, right? The things that I was seeing around me. So like one of the first ones I read was Elizabeth Bishop's The Fish. Oh my God. I loved this poem so much because of like how she commits to the image of this fish that she catches. Like it really made me think about like, it's saying something without saying something. And I really, that one really stuck with me. And then all these other poems too, like I wrote some of them down. Like I was thinking about what poems really like I had been reading at that time. Yusuf Komunyakaa, I remember reading Fast Break for the first time. It's a poem about basketball. And the way that he writes the poem and uses like line break, imagery, rhyme, rhythm to pace it like a fast break, like in basketball, like a fast break. I thought it was so cool, right? I was like, wow, like you can really shape and bend language like that. Even Philip Larkin's This Be the Verse, right? It's a very famous poem that is in a blank verse, I believe, and it has a very fixed rhyme and meter scheme, right? And the first line is, I'm not going to use the curse word, but the first line is, they F you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you, right? And then it keeps going, you know, and, you know, I just loved the almost the playfulness too, but like the subject matter was actually quite serious. And then towards the later, I really appreciated hearing the writers who are writing from an immigrant experience, right? Like Edwidge Danticat, Jamaica Kincaid, like who are looking at things from the outside in. Those are the pieces of writing that really just kind of made me think, wow, like language is so varied and vast and really cool. And to see it kind of, the best novels and the fiction and even nonfiction, I find, are the ones that are poetic in that way, where it's not like overly flowery language. I don't really like that, but it's like, it's showing restraint, right, in the language. And that restraint is what draws you in more so than the plot, if that makes sense. This is why I think I like George Saunders' writing sometimes, because like when he wrote Lincoln in the Bardo, I felt like that was a lot of restraint that he practiced, but he was getting away with some really like, I was like, how is he doing this? You know, like, and it's very piecemeal and fragmented, but it's not everybody's cup of tea. But I just really thought it was so interesting how he was controlling the language to do what he needed it to do.
Right.
Anyways, so yeah. That's my literary journey.
That is a very interesting literary journey. When we talk about craft, though, and I sometimes think about craft as more about the choices you make during the editing and revising process
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to the actual story creation, you
Mm-hmm.
know.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you can really see the impact of craft probably mostly in poetry
I agree.
than you can in the short story or the novel because you are dealing with the economy of words, and every verb or adjective has a powerful meaning in a way that you might paint a scene in a short story that emotes something.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have like 4 lines that say so many things and yet it's still just 4 lines,
Yeah.
that is craftsmanship
Yeah.
at its
agree.
highest level, in my opinion.
I remember in like one of grad school classes, we had to do like research, and the research we had to look at different versions, like manuscripts
Mm-hmm.
of going to like archives and look at different versions of this one particular poem and to see the journey from beginning to end as in how it was eventually published. And I remember that being really eye-opening.
Mm-hmm.
Like it did not look like how it started, right?
Yeah,
like
yeah.
the end version. And you can see because this is what I meant earlier about, I'm always curious, like when I open a book, like, what are you doing in this book, right? So I'm thinking of the author, not only what is happening in the book, like what is the author doing? Comparing different drafts of a poem, for example, like, oh, you can see what they're doing, kind of, right? A little bit of the choices that they're making and things being scratched out. And that too also adds to my real interest in book as a thing. Right.
Yep.
And that's why I still don't read on like Kindle. I can't do it.
Yeah.
I really like books, and that's why I carry books with me. Like you can see my Post-it notes and all that. So the materiality of books, I think, is also really interesting. So when I open a book and I see weird things going on, like little weird gaps or weird drawings or how a paper feels, I think all of that adds to like that idea of like, what are you doing in this book?
That reminded me of in one of my undergrad classes, the professor had us buy this like book. It was the facsimile of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. So you could see all the copies, the notes that he and Ezra Pound wrote to each other and stuff like that.
Wow.
And at first I was like, well, I have to buy this giant book. It's huge too. It's like a giant book. It didn't fit in my book bag. And so, but I remember like reading through, I was like, this is so fascinating to see like the facsimile copies of his handwriting, like scratching things out and then like getting closer to like what you see. And then I think Mark Strand, the poet Mark Strand, for his book Man and Camel, he came out like with this illustrated copy of like him drafting these poems for this book and like with the illustrations, because he was also an artist, like in between. And you could see literally the journey of the poem from beginning to like the end, like version of it. And it was, to your point, like it's so fascinating to see how the craft played out. I don't think you can see that as much in novels, even though it's even more like substantial, like the editing process and all of that.
Yeah, I don't know. I know when I've been toying with writing novels, something that I do, and I did it even with some nonfiction, I keep all my drafts and I date them. Not in a romantic way, but in a numeric way. I give the exact date in which, I either stopped or began a new draft. And the interesting thing is I've been doing more academic stuff more than creative writing stuff for the last several years. And I'm trying to get back into the creative stuff, and I'm going back to some short stories that I've been working through. And when I would go through my folders and I would see all these dates, I was like, man, I wrote a lot of drafts. And when I explain to people my process, it is just that I draft a lot. I do a lot. It takes me a very long time to accomplish writing because I'm always just trying to make it say the way I want it to say the things that I want it to say. And so I have to draft and draft and draft. It's almost like I'm writing myself into the story or writing the story as I'm drafting and not really plotting it out. But, then again, I've not published a novel, so maybe I'm not doing it right. So there's ways to look at it. But, I think that process of going over and revising has at least helped me understand my process and my craft in a way I go about doing it. And sometimes it feels like it's working.
Yeah.
And other times it feels like I'm just writing a whole bunch of stuff.
Well, and that's partly like what we've all come from teaching composition, and that's like the basic idea we try to instill in our students, the importance of revision as part of writing. Or I mean, if revision is writing and writing is revision, and it's hard to convey that to someone who is not interested in the process or is not interested in the craft or what goes into, or doesn't have that kind of curiosity. So it does make you wonder, like, what was it? Obviously, not everybody who took Shakespeare class with Mr. Berkowitz, you know, perked up and decided, oh, I'm gonna be an English major. But something, you know, it sort of cracked open something that was already in me, right? And same for you guys, that opened the door, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't principles of accounting that did it for you.
No, it really was not. But, you know, to sort of, there's a couple of things you did mention, Laura, that I wanted to kind of go back to. But at this point, I think for some students, they need to understand that writing, if you're writing lyrics to a song, you're going to make changes.
Yeah.
There's always going to be some level of revision. I think the ways that students are introduced to writing is often not the way I was introduced to writing. I was introduced to writing through reading.
Yes.
And not through assignments.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, so.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you had an assignment, it was based off of that reading.
Yeah.
You know, so you really had to know.
Yeah.
So like, as you guys were just talking, and especially when you're talking about your revision process, Kofi, I was actually doing some writing this morning, and for myself, and I haven't done that in a long time. And as I was writing, I was thinking, like, it's always the struggle. And I think it's what calls me to read like good stuff. I'm always wondering, like, did you know what the end destination was going to be? You know, like, and how did you know that, right? Like, that's the area I struggle with the most. Sometimes I have a very clear vision for what it's supposed to sound like. Like, it's too short, there's something missing, you know, the pacing is off. But then most of the time I feel like I start off with an idea or an image, and then I'm grappling around. And this is the process, I think, of any writing, is you're just grappling around, and then you pull things in as they're like, this is why I think the imagination is like fascinating, right? Like, as it's connected to other things, you pull that thing in, and, you know, you're wrestling with it. But at what point, like, and this is where I struggle, at what point do I go back and I say, like, okay, this is done. Like, this is it. I think I could revise forever, you know, certain things. And I just, at some point it's done because I give up. I'm like, I give up, you know, there's nowhere else I can take it.
That's
like,
when you submit it to a journal.
That's right. You're like, I'm done with this, you know. But sometimes I go back, like with you, you know, I have a lot of stuff in like the Google Drive, for example, and I'll go back to different dated versions of it and I'll compare it. And I'll read it, and I'm like, I actually like that old version a little bit better, you know? And then, like, you know, and then it keeps going back and forth. But I often wonder, especially as I'm thinking about students writing an AI too, you know, where the end destination is often like given to you, right? Like, it's so much faster. But sometimes it might not fit with what you want it to do. And you have to know what that end destination is, or at least have some kind of vague notion of it. And where does that come from? And I feel like it comes from a deep aesthetic sense, you know, and that, how do you create and cultivate or curate aesthetics, you know, your own personal style? It comes from, I think, an accumulation of things, knowing yourself, but also what have you read and what has really resonated with you, and, you know, how are you kind of bringing that in? Sometimes when I work with students, especially in like a creative writing context, either they don't have the patience for revision, or they don't know where they're going with it, right? Or they think it's like the most original thing under the sun. I'm like, I hate to break it to you, but there's nothing new under the sun, you know, like everything is a remix of something else, you know? Yeah. So I think that's interesting. But I love being with students when they find that aha, like that thing, that piece of poetry or book that like is doing what we just talked about, you know? So anyway.
Yeah. I'll just end with this. I don't think everyone is meant to be a writer or a reader. I think some people are good at listening to stories and not necessarily reading them and not necessarily writing them. But I think tuning your ear to how a story can be really, really rich takes a lot of practice. And I don't think a lot of, not just students, but just people in general, have that patience, But when you are feeling a really good story, you're like, oh
Yes.
my God, I want to see that again or read it again
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
hear it again.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this has been great.
I want to say, when you were talking about Edward P. Jones earlier, we did an episode on the
Mhm.
first day.
Mhm.
And because I kept assigning that story in my lit classes and making the students listen to our podcast, that I kept reading it every semester, right? Because I go in to teach it.
Mhm.
And I have to say, that's one of the, so when you mentioned Edward P. Jones, I thought of that story because that is where we see the thing that the author is doing,
Mhm.
right? As evidenced in the text itself. And every time I read the story, there's something else there to discover. And so I think you talking about practice of reading, I think that's really important,
I agree.
right? It's not that it comes to you naturally, right?
Right.
But just like reading
Yeah.
takes practice too, to be a kind of a reader that you want to be. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I told Frank this morning, it's like, we're about to have a very nerdy conversation about why we
Full
became
nerd.
English majors. But it really is about why we love books, right? Why
Yeah.
we love reading. So thank you, everybody, for joining us for this conversation. You can find us however you find podcasts. Bookish, a casual book club. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed what you just heard, we have a whole universe of podcasts waiting for you. Simply search Dragon Podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. You can also explore our full lineup and discover new shows at podbean.com/dragonpodcasts. That's podbean.com/dragonpodcasts.